BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, everybody. Today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? I hope everyone had a good weekend. On Mondays this year, I've been talking to you guys about the Zodiac Killer, an unidentified serial killer who operated in California in 1968 and 69. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop something down below if you have something to say about the Zodiac Killer. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. Now, the first thing that I have for you guys on the Zodiac Killer News Report is a follow-up from last week's segment. And I was discussing the Zodiac Killer suspect Loring Dale Hill, because there's a husband and wife research team made of Jeff Thornton and Melissa Rose Tappa, and they believe that Jeff's grandfather, Loring Dale Hill, was the Zodiac Killer. Jeff and Melissa run the website zodiackillerbomb.com, and I have to give credit to Ed in the comments section, who named them the Bomb Squad, and they've entered into some trouble in their research journey because there was an allegation made against them that they knowingly held back something that would have exonerated or eliminated their suspect Loring Dale Hill, because the Zodiac Killer wasn't only a serial killer, he also wrote letters, designed ciphers and cryptograms, as well as drawing out diagrams and, of course, the famous greeting cards. And the claim was that one of the final Zodiac letters in the 70s, in the early 70s anyway, came in 1971, and by 1971, their Zodiac Killer suspect, Loring Dale Hill, was not even in the Bay Area of California. He was living in Texas. He moved to Texas in December of 1970. How could he have written and mailed the March 1971 Pleasanton letter, as well as anything else that came after that? And their simple response was, well, it's not impossible for somebody to come back to California and cross state lines. Going from Texas to California over a 2-month time frame is not completely out of reach. But I received a follow-up from that episode, and this is what I would like to discuss with you here on Zodiac Monday. And this person shall remain nameless, but what somebody said was just a series of questions that they wanted to throw, not at Jeff and Melissa, but at me, to try and throw around some challenges, or more or less just asking the question, why are you giving them any credit at all? And I can answer that first question. Why are you defending Jeff and Melissa at all? And it's for everything that I just said. Has their suspect been eliminated? No, not completely. But in all seriousness, I do think that this is a strike against their suspect and the likelihood of him being the Zodiac Killer. But the first question is, you mentioned the 1971 letters. What about the 1974 letters? Yes, the letters do restart in 1974. We have the Zodiac Killer mailing letters into 1971, as I said, with the Pleasanton letter and even the Pines card. But in 1974 is when the letters start again. 1972 and 73 saw the halt in Zodiac Killer activity. But then there's the Exorcist letter in January of 1974. And then the other 3 letters, which I think have a very high chance of being authentic, are the SLA letter, the Badlands card, and the Count Marco letter. These might be listed as unconfirmed communications, but I think that there's a very, very high chance that they did indeed come from the Zodiac Killer. There are lots of similarities among them. Well, it's not unheard of for people to go from one state to another over a 3-year time frame. It's not impossible for somebody to go from Texas to California sometime between any 3-year block of time, especially if they've lived previously in both states. So I don't even think that is a challenge. That's not a problem. No, that's not an issue with their suspect at all. I mean, we're talking about living in the Bay Area in 71. All right, I mean, that's something that makes him less likely, but not ruled out completely. We have at least 5 confirmed letters after Loring Dale Hill left the Bay Area in December of 1970. Were you aware that they were going to write a book and make a documentary? Yes, I know that they were working on a book, but I'm also going to take a very strong stance. I have no problem with people writing books. I have no problem with people putting books out there, even if they want to charge money for them. I mean, this is a standard practice, and this is also something that you're just going to experience in the world of nonfiction. I mean, it's nonfiction exists, right? And I think that the only justifiable way to write a book is if somebody is trying their best to be accurate. Now, no matter whom you are, you'll probably make mistakes at some point, but if someone is genuine, I have no problem if they want to put a book out there. They can put it out themselves on Amazon's own self-publishing website, or maybe if somebody actually contacts them and wants to distribute it through a larger publishing house. If somebody is telling the truth and they have honest intentions, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And what we also have to remember is if people are going to be publishing their own true crime books via Amazon.com, they're not going to earn a lot of money for it. They really will not. It's not like somebody's going to be getting rich off of this. Now, people who have the larger book deals like Gary Stewart and The Most Dangerous Animal of All, yeah, he probably made a lot of money off of that one. Here's a difference, though. The Most Dangerous Animal of All was fraudulent. Gary Stewart was busted on national television for most likely fabricating documents. Somebody in his research team fabricated documents and he was exposed as a genuine fraud. That's bad. That's not acceptable. But the fact that someone just wants to write a book and put it out there, the reason why I don't have a problem with that is because it's one of the few ways that people have to share their story to a larger audience and also to share a more detailed version of their story, where it's not just one video here, one video there. It's not just one article online here and there. It's everything in a 200 or 300 page narrative. As long as someone has honest intentions, I have no problem with that. Were you previously aware that they were going to make a documentary, is the next question. Yes, I was aware of that. But here's the issue with documentaries. You don't just make a documentary. You don't just contact a film studio and be like, hey, I want this documentary made, unless you are already putting an enormous amount of money into it. And if that's the case, that means you already have money, so you don't need to grift anybody. You don't need to do anything for profit because you had the money to begin with. Like, can you just say, hey, Netflix, I want my own 6-part special? I mean, it doesn't happen like that. And once again, people also want to share these things, not purely for profit. Some people want to share their stories about the Zodiac Killer or other true crime cases because they believe that they genuinely have something to say. And it's not simply just, I know the identity of the Zodiac Killer, or I have this answer to another true crime case such as Jack the Ripper and D.B. Cooper. They just want to share their process going through the information. They want to share their own story as part of it. And again, in a documentary format, it's not even your choice unless you have some type of connection in the world of media. So I don't even think that has any type of relevance. The next question here is, were you aware that they tried to insinuate that their suspect, Loringdale Hill, was responsible for the Snoozy and Furlong murders and that Carl Warner was innocent? Well, why on earth would you even ask me that? I mean, the Snoozy and Furlong murders took place in 1969, and a man named Carl Warner was convicted of it. But he would, some people believe that Carl Warner did not do it, and that this crime was actually committed by the Zodiac Killer. Lots of people believe that the Zodiac Killer actually committed the Snoozy and Furlong murders. I have talked to them and for offline conversations, and I've also talked about it here on Black Box Online Radio. Again, where is the fraudulent aspect of that? That is something that I think goes into the category of disputing a fact. And that's what it sounds like Jeff and Melissa wanted to do. They wanted to dispute a fact and think that, oh, they got the wrong guy. Carl Warner was wrongfully convicted. But if you were to ask me personally, I do believe that Carl Warner committed the Snoozy and Furlong murders. I sometimes refer to him as the SFB killer because Carl Warner was convicted for the Snoozy murder, the Furlong murder, and the murder of Kathy Billick, SFB, Snoozy, Furlong, and Billick. They were stabbings that took place in very, very vicious stabbings, with the Snoozy and Furlong victims stabbed over 300 times. The next question is, were you aware that they accused Loringdale Hill of being responsible for the 1969 USS Enterprise fire? Yes, I was aware of that because that's like the heart and soul of their claims on ZodiacKillerBomb.com is that It's the explanation for the gap in Zodiac activity from 1968 to 69, the 7-month gap between the Zodiac killer's first crime at Lake Herman Road and the Blue Rock Spring shooting. They believe that their suspect, Loringdale Hill, was on an aircraft carrier called the USS Enterprise, and there was a fire that took place on January 14th of 1969, and they believe that he was responsible for that. And they do have reasons for this. And, if anything, I think that Loringdale Hill is a stronger suspect for starting the USS Enterprise fire, excuse me. Now, was this done in a calculated way? Was it done in an accidental way? As far as the independent investigations go into the USS Enterprise, a lot of people believe that it was simply an accident and that a vehicle was parked too close to the fuel tank of one of the bombers. Again, this is an aircraft carrier, and that caused an explosion, which sent the fires across the deck. But the fact of the matter is, Jeff and Melissa want to dispute the fact. Loringdale Hill can be placed there. He was in the squadron that would have been on the deck. So, you can do some type of investigation into that. And if anything, as I said, he's a stronger suspect for causing the fire. Now, there is a very important issue. Was it done deliberately or was it done accidentally? A lot of people believe that it was an accident. But one of the reasons why Jeff and Melissa believed that the Zodiac Killer or Loringdale Hill was responsible for that fire is the Zodiac would go on to claim 37 victims and 28 people died on the USS Enterprise, and then they believe that their suspect murdered 9 people, 9 plus 28, 37. That's just something that has come up in their investigations. And the next question is, were you aware that they had a mystery box that has been proved to be fake and contemporary? To provide a little bit of context about this, I believe they purchased the box in Ohio. Someone had a 2-panel box that had a bunch of Zodiac Killer images, and their Zodiac Killer suspect, Loringdale Hill, was from Ohio, and his mother even lived in Ohio at the time of the Zodiac murders, and she was a reporter for the paper, and she wrote a lot of things about him and his naval service, and even about him surviving the fire. And Melissa purchased this box that it had 2 panels and lots of pictures of the Zodiac Killer, and, she just wanted to know more about it. And I asked one follow-up question to the person who wrote this message, and that was pretty much just, how did you obtain this information that box with the Zodiac Killer pictures was fraudulent? And they did some backtracking on the images and tracing, and it turns out that some of them were from 2010 and onwards. One of them was even fan art that was created on the internet. All right, fair enough. I more or less just asked that person one question and then blocked that person because I think that it's just somewhat unnecessary to try and intimidate me for simply talking about Zodiac Killer news. And here's a very, very big point. A lot of these issues came about because Melissa and Jeff appeared on the panel discussion show that's available on the channel Mysteries with Mr. Belchique, and they were heavily challenged by a different Zodiac Killer researcher named Druzer. And Druzer was pointing out some of his own genuine concerns about the suspect Loringdale Hill and Jeff and Melissa's investigation and research process. So I think that these questions were a twofold response to that somebody sent to me. Well, as far as siding with somebody, if anything, I side more with Druzer and his genuine concerns about Loringdale Hill as a Zodiac Killer suspect. If anything, I side with Druzer and his genuine causes for skepticism. I side with his skeptical intuition. So I thought that these questions were purely unnecessary. And yes, ultimately at the end it says, the move to Texas and then from Ohio. Excuse me, let me read that again. Whilst the move to Texas, then Ohio, from 1970 to 1974, doesn't categorically rule out Loringdale Hill, the question is, why do they not mention this? Well, I think they have, and as Melissa even said when she posted everything they're talking about on her website, ZodiacKillerBomb.com, and I think this person and I are in complete agreement. I think even Druzer is also in complete agreement that there is not something there that completely rules out their suspect because he moved to Texas in 1970, letters continued into 1971, as well as 74. That doesn't completely eliminate somebody, but I think all three of us would be in agreement that, yes, their suspect looks less and less likely and less viable. But one more time, you can read more about the Zodiac Killer suspect, Loringdale Hill, at ZodiacKillerBomb.com. Now, the next thing that I have for you here on the Zodiac Killer News Report is something that was just recommended to me by the website Blurb. I first used Blurb because I was reading the book that was written by Wolfgang Schindler about the Zodiac killer suspect Henning Loggies. Someone informed me about him. He was a German immigrant to Canada, and they have their own theory as to how and why Henning Loggies went on to become a serial killer. But Blurb recommended a book called Cryptology Collections. And this is one that I want to talk about real fast because the Zodiac Killer also mailed his very famous cryptograms, the Z408, the Z340, the Z13, and the Z32. And this book came out in August. And this says, the Cryptology Collections book is a series of innovative coded designs inspired by female code breakers. Kristen DeToni creates intricate and beautiful patterns with hidden messages using a variety of codes such as the Rosicrucian cipher, barcode, Morse code, and the Greek square cipher, to name a few. Learn about women code breakers of World War I and World War II while trying to crack the code designs. If you love codes, coding, cryptology, and beautiful graphics, this book is not only entertaining but exquisite and alluring. And one more time, it was written by Kristen DeToni. And if anything, I would love to know what she had to say about Morse code, because there was a Zodiac Killer researcher out there named Gareth Penn, who was a very big believer that the Zodiac Killer included Morse code into a lot of his messages, and that more or less he was using Morse code and binary to send all types of hidden particular messages. And I just simply want to know what some other researcher or writer has to say about Morse code and ciphers. And if we're going to talk about ciphers, I'm going to give a shout out to one of these cipher guys out there, Chad Burke, who runs the group The Search for the Zodiac, which you can find on Facebook. And Chad does a regular segment in his group called The Zodiac Report. And I'm going to look at his Zodiac Report for December 1st of 2024. And he's going to be discussing the Zodiac Killer's first confirmed crime, the Lake Herman Road Murders, as well as two sets of homicides that took place in the early 1960s. The Domingos Edwards murders of 1963 and the Swindle murders of 1964. And there are really going to be two major questions that we're going to explore here on Zodiac Monday. Today, after reviewing evidence such as the possible attacks on Domingos Edwards and the Swindles, both using .22 caliber and both sniper style, I also call to mind his threat to snipe a bus full of kids. I have made a possible discovery. I believe this is the Zodiac's real MO. We begin at Lake Herman Road, where 8 bullets were recovered and 2 were in the car. 1 was in David Faraday and 5 were in Betty Lou Jensen. 10 casings. Possible scenario. The Zodiac emerges from behind the pump house gate and surprises them. Fires bullets, 1 which hits the car, and 2 which fall furthest away. But really he means the first one hits the car, and this is, I think what he's trying to say is the warning shot, or the bullet that goes through the car that is not thought to have actually been meant to hit the victims, and that's why the shell casing is furthest away. He then runs to the front of the car and fires over the top of it, and the second bullet can be found. Casing 2 drops. He then runs up and kills David Faraday. Bullets 2 and 3 and casings 2 and 3. He then fires around into the car, attempting to assassinate Betty Lou Jensen. Bullets 3 in the head and in the headliner, and casing 4 in the car. Zodiac now maneuvers to a position to fire a shot, and then 4 more up close. Bullets 4 through 9 and casings 5 through 9. Either a casing is thrown from there to throw off the investigators, which does not seem to be too far-fetched considering that this may be the very same ammo from other possible and previous attacks, and he may be forensically savvy by now, or maybe it was just another wild shot. Remember, there was no second set of vehicle tracks. There were hunters, though. Was the Zodiac a sniper? Was that one of his dirty little secrets? So I think that there are going to be two major questions that we have to discuss here. And the first one is, was the Zodiac a sniper? You just heard it there. And the second one is something that I think is a little bit more complicated, and I'm going to save that one for the second part, where we're looking at, did the Zodiac Killer emerge from the pump house gate as opposed to driving his car up to Lake Herman Road? Let's start with the sniper attacks first. I think what Chad is trying to say is that first we have the Domingos Edwards murders in 1963, where Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards were shot and gunned down. Then we have the Swindle murders in February of 1964, where Johnny Ray and Joy Swindle are shot and gunned down, and this is one that has been widely discussed about how they believe that the murder of Johnny Ray and Joy Swindle, which took place in Southern California, was committed by somebody who had some type of reasonable marksmanship abilities, because they are first shot from a distance with a .22 caliber firearm, and then the killer moves closer and closer to them. So this is something that could show someone who had some type of military background. Whereas with the Domingos Edwards murders, it appears that some type of confrontation took place, but multiple shots were fired indeed. And again, there could be some type of military background from the perpetrator. In fact, I believe that the murderer of Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards most likely had a military background. Now, was he a sniper? In the Domingos Edwards murders, I think that it's a little bit less likely, because he definitely didn't seem to show any type of cool, calm, and collected abilities when he was shooting Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards. 26 shots were fired, so it almost seems like he is getting trigger happy, definitely not cool, calm, and collected. With the Lake Herman Road murders, the first confirmed Zodiac Killer crime that took place in 1968, there was a big challenge that came to Chad from Ross Geraci of Planet X Filmworks, when he simply said, if the Zodiac Killer were a sniper, it's almost as if he forgot all of his military training during the Zodiac crimes of the late 1960s. Because when you look at the Lake Herman Road murders, Betty Lou Jensen is shot multiple times while she is running away, and there aren't consistent patterns with the shots. They are not fired in ways in which it shows that there is any type of major collection of the bullets. In short, the Zodiac is just firing 5 shots at Betty Lou Jensen as she is running away quickly. And I've said before, I think it's because he shot David Faraday in the head, and that Betty Lou Jensen was startled, so she started running, and the Zodiac is just firing 5 shots almost in a spray, and the bullets are just hitting Betty Lou Jensen, and he just got lucky, and, lucky for him, not for her, and she passed away. And if we look at the entire context of Zodiac activities in the late 1960s, we also have the Blue Rock Springs shooting. And this is another point that I think Ross even brought up in his response to Chad Burke, and that is that if the Zodiac were indeed a sniper, he is even sloppier with the shooting at Blue Rock Springs, where Mike Mageau is more or less just sprayed with bullets again in the car at Blue Rock Springs. The Zodiac walks up to the car at the Blue Rock Springs park, and he's shining a flashlight into the car, and he is more or less just spraying Darlene Ferrin and Mike Mageau with bullets, and Mike Mageau is shot in multiple places, including the lower leg, the jaw, and Mike Mageau survived. So this definitely doesn't seem like someone who has a lot of strong marksmanship abilities. And even after Ross Geraci's comments, I know someone who is also going to challenge this notion that the Zodiac Killer was an excellent marksman, or that he was a trained sniper, and that would be Michael Butterfield of ZodiacKillerFacts.com. And he wrote out a very large post once called The 10 Myths of the Zodiac Killer Case, and I believe it's actually myth number 1, where he states that the Zodiac Killer was an expert marksman. That is a very common belief that some people have, and Michael Butterfield wants to dispute that for all of the reasons that I've just listed. Now, there's something, though, that is interesting from Chad's post that we can examine, and that was, did the Zodiac Killer carry a rifle at Lake Herman Road? The ammunition was .22 caliber, which can be used in a handgun or rifle. .22 caliber long rifle ammunition. And I think that there are 2 points that I want to discuss. The first is, it would make a lot of sense to me if the Zodiac used a rifle at Lake Herman Road for the following reason. He stated that he tied and taped a pencil flashlight to the gun barrel, and a pencil flashlight would be something that I think would be suitable on a rifle, because it's also something that's reported to have been done by hunters. And yes, on a rifle, that does seem reasonable to me. But the evidence for carrying a handgun is the Zodiac used handguns at his other crimes. The Blue Rock Springs shooting, he carried a handgun at Lake Berryessa, and he also murdered Paul Stein with a handgun. And this is something that I think is very important to think about, because this just shows that that's his preference, and it's also the type of weapon that you would expect someone would use when they're going to be blindsiding teenagers at Lake Herman Road. But there's something that's even more important than that, and that relates to the way that David Faraday is shot. That the Zodiac is just pressing the gun barrel and like right against David Faraday's head, more or less. David Faraday was shot execution style, for simplicity's sake, at Lake Herman Road, and that to me suggests that he may have been carrying a handgun. Now, this whole thing about how the Zodiac Killer was actually hiding at the pump house gate, because let's talk about that for a second. This is fascinating, and I'm always liking these types of discussions, because this would mean that the Zodiac Killer did not drive up to Lake Herman Road, that he walked up, and that he maybe had a vehicle stationed somewhere nearby, and that he's actually just waiting for somebody to come by. I mean, this is also something that's really interesting to think about, because it would explain the shell casing that's far away from David Faraday's car. Was the Zodiac just hiding in the behind the gate and waiting for some teenagers to approach? That I can be more curious about. Now, there was a witness sighting of two cars in the parking lot at Lake Herman Road, and one of them matched David Faraday's description, and some people think that the other car was the Zodiac's. But let's look at what Chad is talking about. The Zodiac is hiding behind the gate, and he's just waiting for somebody to show up so he can attack them. I don't think this would require any sniper-like abilities, but I think that this is also going to show that the Zodiac may have been doing things that were very sneaky. The Zodiac may, as Chad said in his post, be forensically aware of things. And he would just know that, alright, people are going to think that I'm committing this crime in the parking lot. Everybody's thinking that I drove up, but in reality, I actually go back behind the pump house gate and I run away to a different vehicle that's stationed nearby. He's doing things that would confuse people, and I like that type of thought process. And one more time, you can read the Zodiac reports in the group The Search for the Zodiac, which is run by Chad Burke. When we look at the letters of the Zodiac Killer, we can see something that is very apparent. The Zodiac Killer did not like police officers. In his letters, he frequently refers to them as pigs and blue meanies. And last week on the Zodiac Killer News Report, I was telling you guys that I started the book One Night in October by Gerald Gregory Doan. And this is one that tells the story of somebody who was a police officer responding to the murder of Paul Stine and the investigations that took place. Paul Stine was, of course, the final victim of the Zodiac Killer. And I'm going to do a much larger episode on Gerald Gregory Doan's observations about the murder of Paul Stine. As previously stated, this book was written by one of the investigators. But one thing that is discussed in the early sections of the book is, why would the Zodiac Killer have this type of animosity toward police officers? And one possibility that is put forward in the book is it had to do with the 1960s, and it had to do with some of the current events that took place. And a lot of people are going to jump into some types of counterculture, but this goes so far beyond that. What I think Gerald Gregory Doan is trying to point out is that there were multiple events that took place that were publicized by the media or just talked about in the San Francisco Bay Area that would have created a lot of anti-police sentiment. And one of them is the Hunters Point riot. And this was actually something that I'm going to cite in an essay from Chris Carlson that's available on Found San Francisco, foundsf.org. And let's look at some things that took place. And you can read more about this in the book One Night in October, but also on foundsf.org. The San Francisco Police Department deployed at Newcomb and 3rd Streets on September 28th of 1966. On September 27th of 1966, a white police officer shot and killed a 17-year-old African-American teen. In another crime that is discussed in the book One Night in October that is relevant to the anti-police sentiment that went on in the 1960s was the murder of Officer Herman George. Herman George was an African-American police officer, but there is a write-up about him on odmp.org. And it says that Officer Herman George was shot as he sat in the Hunters Point Project police station, also same name as the Hunters Point riots, and 3 assailants opened fire with .30 caliber rifles on Officer George and 2 other officers, as 2 other officers type reports. Officer George was shot 6 times and another officer was wounded, but Officer George succumbed to his wounds on December 16th of 1967. Officer George had been a member of the San Francisco Police Department for 4 years. He is survived by his wife and 4 children. So what I believe the book One Night in October is trying to talk about is, in 1966, you had this tragedy that led to the riots. And then in 1967, you had an ambush that was launched on the precinct, which led to the death of Officer George. And if you're going to talk about any type of race relations, I mean, Officer George was an African American. So I think that this is not racially motivated. This is anti-police. This is just the anti-blue meanie sentiment that is going around in the minds of the people who committed the attacks. However, I mean, we have to say rest in peace to Officer Herman L. George, and of course, rest in peace to the other victims. They didn't deserve to die like this. This is only shared to show that in the 1960s in California, a lot of people had been exposed to countless sources that would have created anti-police sentiment, and these beliefs were widely held among many different people. And moving on here on Zodiac Monday, I would like to talk about the new episode of the Zodcast, which is hosted by Drew Beeson. Drew Beeson is also the author of Sighting In on the Zodiac Killer. And Drew had a guest on his program named Sepper Karimi. I first began corresponding with Sepper back in 2022. He was the person who made a very interesting suggestion, and that is that in 1966, we saw the murder of Sherry Jo Bates, where a teenager, she was 18 years old, she was murdered outside of the RCC, the Riverside City College Library. And then in December of 1966, they uncovered the desktop poem, the one that says, "Sick of living, unwilling to die, blood spilled all over her dress, oh well, it was red anyway." And it was signed R.H. And Sepper was the person who brought something to my attention that this may have been someone trying to pay homage to the poet R.H. Barlow. And again, I approached it with some natural skepticism, and I was thinking, okay, come on, this is just a wild idea. This is just a shot in the dark. But after reading more of the poems of R.H. Barlow, I began to think that that was somewhat of a viable and defendable observation. But Sepper not only appeared on Drew Beeson's show, The Zodcast, he also appeared on the panel discussion show available on Mysteries with Mr. Belgique. And he had a lot of observations about the Zodiac Killer and the comic book connection, because one thing that seems very apparent in the world of the Zodiac Killer is that he was not using his own original ideas. The Zodiac was not somebody who was just pulling things out of his own imagination. A lot of the things that he did were influences from other pieces of existing literature, songs, movies, and, as we're going to see, comic books. And I'm going to be discussing that in this segment here. But I want to look at a challenge question first that was brought up by Sepper on his appearance on the Zodiac Killer panel discussion show, and that is, could we create a profile of the Zodiac and then look at everyone who matches the profile and include them as likely candidates to have actually been the Zodiac Killer, and exclude anyone who does not match that profile? So, I mean, I think it's a very interesting question, and the person who responded to him was Drewzer, who said no, because all profiles are going to be wrong. All types of psychological profiles and behavioral profiles like that are going to be wrong. And I think it's a great question, but ultimately I side with Drewzer for the following reason. Can we just create a profile of everything that the Zodiac Killer did and thought and had, and eliminate suspects who don't match that profile? I don't think so, for the following reason. Psychological profiles are educated guesses, and people are going to try their best to get it right, but what if it turns out that the Zodiac Killer was not in the Navy or the Air Force, and he was in a different branch of the military, something like the Coast Guard? What if it turns out that the Zodiac Killer did not have any military connection at all? People have reasons why they think that the Zodiac Killer was formerly in the Navy and the Air Force, but we could be surprised, we could be proven wrong about things. There are going to be times when people are disputing the facts, as I said at the beginning of this recording. So I think that profiles are valuable for discussions, and sometimes the profilers can be accurate. Sometimes the profilers can be spot on. Earlier this year, I was talking about John Emile List on the True Crime Talk Radio in the morning segment, John Emil List and his connections to the D.B. Cooper case, but that is one where the psychological profilers and the forensic artists absolutely got almost everything right. Profiling can be valuable if it is done in an accurate way. And I said that I wanted to come back to the comic book angle because I think these were the strongest and most fascinating parts of Ciphers' appearance on the Zodcast when he was looking at possible Zodiac Killer inspirations or how the Zodiac Killer could have taken ideas from comic books. Some of the more famous examples are the Tim Holt comic that features the Wheel of Death, where Tim Holt is in his red mask character and another character named Lady Doom is trying to spin the death wheel. And is he going to die by rope, by knife, by gun, or by fire? And that seems like a very direct reference that was used by the Zodiac Killer. Another possible comic book inspiration was from the Red Rider comics, which could have given us the flying V symbol used by the Zodiac Killer. But when I was watching Sepper on the Zodcast, he talked about possibly being inspired by the character The Thing because of some of the linguistic choices that the Zodiac Killer would use, talking about wanting to do his thing and bolding the letter or writing it in a bold type and with 6 exclamation points. But the one that really stood out to me, in fact, my biggest takeaway from Sepper's appearance on the Zodcast was he discussed the Mickey Finn comics, and it's one that I am not extremely familiar with. But in this comic strip, there is a college that is created. There's a school that was created called Averly. And when the Zodiac Killer would write some of his letters and communications, he was trying to get the attention of a reporter named Paul Avery, but he would write the name Averly. For example, if you look at the Halloween card, you will see the envelope, and the envelope says it's written to Paul Averly, and Averly was mentioned in the Mickey Finn comics. To provide a little bit of background information, Mickey Finn was an American comic strip created by cartoonist Lank Leonard, which was syndicated to newspapers from April 6 of 1936 to September of 1977. So, I mean, anybody who was born within that time frame would probably grow up and have these types of comic strips around. And this is a point that I just need to reinforce over and over again. It is totally normal for people to keep these types of things in their house, to have older issues of things just lying around. We did this well into the 90s, just having piles of magazines, putting them on the bookcase even. This is perhaps something that we might not see too much unless somebody is a very intense collector in the new millennium, but at this time it would have been completely normal. Mickey Finn was a successful lighthearted strip, and it struck a balance between comedy and drama. And if anybody wants to read more, it was adapted into a 400-page little big book that is available. But as far as the characters and the story goes, the storyline centered on a likable Irish-American police officer named Michael Aloysius Finn, who went by the name Mickey. So now we're dealing with another type of the police officer angle, and this is one point where some people have tried to identify causes and reasons for the Zodiac Killer's choices to label the cops and pigs as just that, pigs, to label the cops as pigs, to label the cops as blue meanies. Why did the Zodiac Killer do that? Some people think it's because the Zodiac Killer was a rejected police officer, an officer that was fired, an officer that was demoted, an officer that was kicked out of the police academy. Because on the one hand, there are clues that would indicate that the Zodiac Killer had some type of law enforcement or criminological background, and then there are other types of clues that would indicate that the Zodiac Killer was just somebody who was part of the counterculture and did not like police officers at all. Which one do you think it was? So this comic is centered on Mickey Finn, and he is from the suburban Port Chester, New York. Leonard based the character on the Port Chester policeman Mickey Brennan, a real person, after watching Brennan helping children cross the street. Like other police strips, it surfaced in the wake of the blockbuster Dick Tracy, but Mickey Finn was analogous to the popular 1970s television program Barney Miller, focusing on humor and character rather than on mystery and stories. Historian Tom Wisson found it to be one of the few comic strips ever to portray a policeman in a manner that avoided either sentimentality or sensationalism. And, full credit to the creator of this one, because I think that might be something that is lacking from the discussion. And as you see, that's a very, very middle ground and balanced approach to creating this character. And I don't necessarily know if we can gain any type of understanding into the Zodiac Killer's world if he chose to reference something like this. What I think this relates more to is something that Drew Beeson said on the Zodcast, and that is that it appears that the Zodiac Killer isn't doing things for arbitrary reasons. And I'm about 85% in agreement with Drew Beeson when he said this. The Zodiac Killer does not do things simply just because it's arbitrary. It's not because he just felt like it. It's not because there's no thought process behind it. Almost everything in the Zodiac Killer mystery seems to have some type of understanding or some type of connection to a different piece of material. They're references to things that he understood. They're connections to things from his past. They are insights into the world. And it's not simply that we're just saying this. The Zodiac Killer wrote about this very directly on the Halloween card when he was saying that, I know you ate to know my name, but I'll clue you in, but then why spoil the game? The Zodiac is saying that he's dropping hints to his identity in the letters and the cards and the diagrams and in the ciphers. The Zodiac is saying all of this stuff. So I think that it's something that as I said, 85% in agreement with. The 15% of doubt that I have relates back to profiling. We do not know these things with 100% certainty, and we also are unable to say things with absolute clarity to the point where, okay, this is exactly what the Zodiac Killer was thinking. A lot of people claim to do that, and a lot of people are just putting out their scenarios where they can more or less think that they can read the Zodiac Killer's mind. But I don't think like that. I think there are clues, and I think there are pieces of evidence. And if you want to say something like the Zodiac Killer was inspired by the Mickey Finn comics, maybe you have a very defendable claim. As I said, 85% in agreement, 15% always being somewhat skeptical. Now, if we're going to go down that pathway, I think that there were also a lot of other good comments that were made by Sepper when he was discussing a particular Zodiac Killer suspect named Don Chaney. And Don Chaney is, of course, a suspect of Drew Beeson, and Don Chaney is discussed a lot in the book Sighting In on the Zodiac Killer. And if you would like to hear more about Don Chaney as a Zodiac Killer suspect, I invite you to watch the full long-form interview with Sepper Karimi on the Zodcast. It's about 1 hour and 50 minutes long, but there's a lot of suspect profile information there. And lastly, I would like to give a shout out to Vincent McConnell, who runs the channel New Coach 2024. And Vincent asked me a particular question about why Thomas Henry Horan was talking about the Zodiac Killer. Thomas Henry Horan is the author of The Myth of the Zodiac Killer, and his Zodiac Killer suspect is named Hal Snook. Although, as I said, this is the myth of the Zodiac Killer. So he says that Hal Snook wrote at least 2 of the letters, the debut letter and the August 4th letter, and that maybe someone else took over writing the letters, but that the letters were not written by the killer, and that these were unrelated murders that were linked together by a series of letters and cryptograms, as well as the other previously mentioned points, the diagrams and the cards. But he said, why is Thomas Horan talking about the Zodiac Killer? And I was just asking for more clarity and saying that Thomas Horan is also the host of the Stones Unturned podcast, but I haven't heard any of his recent episodes. Was there a particular episode that he wanted a response to? And it was not quite that, but just an overall general discussion about why he brings up the Golden State Killer, Joseph D'Angelo, but doesn't quite get to the point. And my simple response is that I first started listening to the Stones Unturned podcast back in 2020. And I've said it once and I'll say it again. In 2020, the story I'll Be Gone in the Dark was everywhere. It was based on the book written by Michelle McNamara, who coined the term Golden State Killer. They made a mini-series for HBO that was called I'll Be Gone in the Dark of the same name. They also released the I'll Be Gone in the Dark podcast, and countless YouTube channels, even Black Box Online Radio, was covering the story of the Golden State Killer because the court proceedings were still taking place. Why is Thomas Horan doing this? All I remember him saying back in 2020 about the Golden State Killer was that he did not believe that the Golden State Killer did it alone. He's like, there is no way that one person committed all of these crimes, 12 murders, 50 rapes, and over 120 burglaries, that he would have had some type of outside assistance. But I've noticed that This type of thought process is only valuable when you have the hard evidence to back it up. This type of thought process is only suitable when you actually have some way of connecting everything together, when you actually have reasons for making the types of connections, because I've noticed what a lot of people do is they do something that's quite similar to that documentary that I was discussing recently, The Truth About Jim, which looks at Jim Mordecai as a Zodiac killer suspect. When somebody thought that Jim Mordecai was a suspicious character, that he was perhaps responsible for real sex crimes in Northern California, and her name was Sierra Barter. She's the featured participant in the documentary. So she began to look for crimes in the area that could have been committed by Jim Mordecai. And I'm just saying, whoa, wait a second. You're looking for crimes that could have been committed by Jim because you think that he was a sex offender, therefore he had to have committed other crimes? How about following the hard evidence and allowing the evidence to guide you to the suspect, as opposed to choosing a suspect and trying to make other crimes fit? And ultimately, I don't think that Jim Mordecai was the Zodiac killer, and Joseph D'Angelo, whom I've just been discussing, is also a Zodiac killer suspect, and I just think it's the exact same thing. People are zoning in on one serial killer story, the Golden State Killer story, and then they try to connect it to the Zodiac Killer mystery for the same reason, looking at other possible crimes. They just want to read about every possible crime in California during the 1960s and trying to think, some way, somehow, can I make this fit into some type of interconnected web? And with Thomas Henry Horn's material, it's very similar. It's looking for connections among the criminals to just try and formulate the connections for the sake of formulating the connections. And that's an impractical thing to do, because in the true crime world, it's about the truth, right? It should be all about looking at analyzing the facts, and it's that whole concept of allowing the evidence to direct you to a suspect, not taking a suspect and trying to make interwoven connections between and among their social connections. But I'd love to know what you guys think about any of these things. What do you think about Don Chaney as a Zodiac killer suspect? What do you think about a Zodiac Golden State Killer connection? What do you think about Jim Mordecai as a Zodiac killer suspect? And I've been talking a lot about the Zodiac and the counterculture in this episode, so I would love to know what you guys think about a Zodiac killer suspect like Richard Gaikowski, who was heavily involved in the 60s counterculture. And the final thing that I have is, of course, your supporter shoutouts. You can support this channel at buymeacoffee.com, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxnid88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And our first one comes to us from Batman66. Batman66, thank you so much for your regular and consistent support. And our second one comes to us from River Prawn Pottery. River Prawn Pottery is also a regular and consistent supporter. And now CZ Guy. CZ Guy is a regular and consistent supporter as well. You three are absolutely amazing. I thank you so much for everything. I thank you so much for everything you've done for Black Box Online Radio. And I would like to give an additional shout out to Art Banksy, who has provided a lot of the images for this episode, a lot of the images that you see going by on the screen. Thank you, Art Banksy. And one more time, there's a reminder that there is a fan page for Black Box Online Radio on Instagram under the name Not Ray Johnson. Not Ray Johnson has the fan page. And you can contact this program at blackboxonlineradio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is Ned Dahan, but I have a page for Black Box Online Radio on Facebook that's becoming more and more active. And there is always blackboxnid88 over on Instagram. And I will see you guys over there. Goodbye.